Hey, what's
Hi
up?
there, Brian.
How
Hi, how
are
are
you?
you?
Good. How are
Thank
you doing?
Very well. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
There, I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Well, thanks
So
for having
first
me
of
on.
all, no, thanks to you. Thanks for your valuable time. It's such a huge honor. I've been binge watching all your progressive overload podcasts and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, so I know it's a topic you are really involved in. So huge honor to
Mhm.
be a part of it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's one of those things like I feel like I've talked about quite a bit, but is still pretty grossly misunderstood. So I think it always helps. It's even if I'm tired of talking about it, but I'm always happy
Yeah,
to. So
I can imagine. It's such a nuanced topic, and it's also really misunderstood. But anyway, can you give a brief introduction of yourself to begin with the lecture, please?
yeah, my name is BDMinor. I am a coach. I own my own coaching business since 2015. I've been coaching since about 2011, 2012, and have a master's in health and exercise science from Colorado State University. And yeah, and just enjoy the kind of the physiological side of learning about muscle growth. Kind of a nerd, but um, yeah, training and nutrition are two topics that, or I guess global topics that really interest me. So
And also a pro natural bodybuilder and
yeah,
powerlifter, right?
yeah, I am. Yeah. So it's been a while since I've competed in either. So 2017 was the last time I did
All
um,
right.
a meet or my last bodybuilding prep. But hopefully next year, at least hopefully do a meet. There's one in March that I'm kind of eyeing. So
But you did a game of peak of bodybuilding with Derek Helms
yeah,
fairly recently, right?
I whooped Eric Helms' ass in some pickup bodybuilding online. So he he's afraid to challenge me again, I think. But it's
Yeah,
is what it
you
is.
can you kind of smoked them, man. To tell you the truth.
No, it's yeah, he brought a really impressive physique last time he competed. So it's always good to see people kind of breaking new ground whenever they compete, which is the goal, right? So
Right, and that should be a trend. I mean, you have peak of basketball, why not peak of bodybuilding, right? Just take off your
yeah,
shirts and
yeah, you only
get
have
a,
to get in
get
you
a,
only have to get in shape one time, and then you can just use photos for the rest of your life and not have to worry about dieting
that's
again.
that's pretty much my case, actually. But anyway, so progressive overload, and specifically in regards to hypertrophy training, I wanted to begin the chat with you, Brian. Uh, Talking about why is hypertrophy not actually a performance-based adaptation? Meaning, okay, if we want to get stronger, well, we lift heavy things, but if we wanna get bigger, how can I get better at hypertrophy training, right? So can we establish all the important points?
Yeah, I think sometimes it helps to kind of view things actually through the lens of strength first. I think strength is, um, people kind of look at strength as a specific adaptation when, strength or performance is really it's the summation of many different adaptations. So it's the ability to express different adaptations, within the context of what your structure is and limitations there. But hypertrophy in and of itself, it is a type of adaptation, both at the fiber level and whole muscle level. And performance is, especially in natural athletes, probably the best proxy we have for hypertrophy over time, outside of obviously changes in visual assessment, which can, you take into account with an advanced trainee that they've been, the rate of muscle gain is pretty slow. And, they have more adipose tissue in those phases where they're gaining muscle. Like visual changes can be hard to assess. And I think, with natural competitors, especially, you sometimes it takes dieting back down to really see the fruits of your labor. So, so performance, I think, is it's a way to sort of assess the effectiveness of a strategy. I mean, it's not perfect because you can have increases in performance in the absence of hypertrophy because, like I said before, strength is a multifaceted expression of different adaptations. So, you can become more neurologically efficient, more coordinated in a movement and see increases in strength and not have any muscle growth. And so that's why it's important, to be viewing performance, across multiple rep ranges over a long period of time in order to really leverage that as a tool.
Because that becomes quite a challenge, as you said. Maybe not all people have DEXA scan available at all times,
Mm-hmm.
and even a DEXA scan is kind of limited, and especially in the natural bodybuilding community, to see visual changes, significant visual changes, takes a really long time. So during that time, how can we actually know that we're training for effective hypertrophy? And as you said, we have the strength measurements, or
So,
at least a proxy.
yeah. What was the question again?
Well, it was why is hypertrophy not a performance-based adaptation like strength
Yeah,
per se?
it's you know, hypertrophy is more of like it responds to, mechanical tension is influenced by, the process of hypertrophy. It's a cellular cascade of processes, that are initiated primarily by mechanical tension. And as we get stronger, our threshold, I guess if we're looking at things on a fiber level, as we get stronger, our threshold for overload, our ability to, the amount of force that we need, that threshold for force that we need to reach in order to spur an adaptation is going to increase. And so it's more about keeping pace with these adaptations in order to continue to place mechanical tension, on those like higher threshold fibers, because each fiber, as you hypertrophy, is all else equal, is going to be able to produce a little bit more force. And so
Right.
your overload threshold, or your recruitment threshold in terms of force requirements is going to go up.
So I think one way to view training for hypertrophy is to get sufficient tension to actually um, to elevate muscle protein synthesis. Is this correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you want, sufficient mechanical tension at the fiber level. I mean, there is some evidence of, whole muscle tension having, a contributing factor to hypertrophy, but it seems that, fiber level hypertrophy, or,
Right.
tension at the fiber level, and having, high degrees of cross bridging at the fiber level, result in greater amounts of mechanical tension on that fiber level. And so I think that's an important distinction, because when I think people, oftentimes when they think of mechanical tension, they think of, synonymous with heavier weight. And,
Right.
it's not always the case. I mean, if you're training closer to failure, the tension on, the fibers that are, shouldering that load, due to fatigue, those higher threshold fibers that are starting to contribute more, those are going to be experiencing pretty high degrees of mechanical tension by themselves. And so, I think that the first thing is, understanding that tension at the fiber level is what we're primarily concerned with there.
I think it's quite often that people say that volume is the main driver for hypertrophy, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a misunderstanding also because it's not the main driver. It would be actually tension that we can get through sufficient volume and most importantly, the intensity of effort.
I agree. And I think, I think a lot of these debates, exist largely because people have different definitions for how they're, viewing
Yeah.
this terminology. So, tension, without sufficient tension, sufficient magnitude of tension, you're going to be limited. And without a, sufficient duration of exposure, you're going to be, constrained there as well. So they're both important. But, the volume can kind of be viewed as like the duration component of that, and in proximity to failure, both load and proximity to failure are both extremely important when, assessing how much mechanical tension and, fiber recruitment you're going to be experiencing and tension on those fibers. Because, the closer you're training to failure, I shouldn't say the closer necessarily, but once you get past a, level of adequate requisite effort, you're going to be, recruiting more high threshold fibers. And so that can also occur with heavy load, out of the gate. And so, the mechanical tension in and of itself, it can be achieved, in terms of magnitude within, one set. But
Right.
the duration of exposure, the volume of that exposure is going to be, influenced by, number of sets and things like that. So they're both important. I think the reason that, in the research that volume's really, been shown to be, quote unquote, the driver. And I'm not a big fan of that terminology. I mean, I understand the context that it's used within, but I think it gets misinterpreted because people, think, okay, as long as I equate volume or equate volume load, intensity of effort isn't that important, and that's simply not true. So and I think that the heavier you train and the greater the recruitment is out of the gate, you can get away with equating volume a little bit easier. Like that's a better proxy for total volume when you're training a bit heavier. But if you're training with like 50% 1RM and you're using volume load to assess the dose of your hypertrophy stimulus, it can be pretty misleading if you're not accounting for the intensity of effort. So, but in the research, they tend to standardize the intensity of effort. Like it'll say, if you look at the methods within a study, which I'm sure you've seen, it'll say sets were performed between 6 to 10 RM with loads being adjusted as needed to maintain the rep range, and so all of these sets are standardized in terms of effort in most cases with a lot of this research. And so that's sort of been accounted for. And so with that said, that leaves the moving variable is volume. And there does seem to be a positive, dose response with that, at least up to a point. And we know that relationship is, there's kind of an inverted U relationship there. So, but yeah, I think the message that more volume is better is, it's missing some of the context of where that recommendation came from.
And most of the studies are almost carried out to failure. Some protocols of the studies are like, we did 10 sets of squats all to failure 3-4 times a week, and I'm like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And that brings up the argument of what, like, I understand the reason they're doing it because they want to standardize effort, but what does failure look like in some of these studies, and
right.
more so it's like getting and using the research on volume. I think it's important to view it as a concept more so than depending on how you're performing those sets and depending on the exercise execution,
Right.
all of that's going to influence the amount of volume that, you're going to benefit from. And so, I tend to, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but look at things more from like a bottom-up approach when it comes to assessing volume. Like look at exercise execution first, exercise selection, intensity of effort. And then from there, once you have those accounted for, you have a much better, description of an insight into how much volume that person can actually handle rather than, an arbitrary amount between 10 and 20 sets, which is there's value in having those ranges is a starting point, but all volume isn't created equal when you're in the gym.
Right. Very well. So when we talk about hypertrophy, our goal in the gym is to get sufficient tension through the all the variables of training, which are volume and intensity of effort. So that's, I think I like to think about it as a starting point. But in regards to hypertrophy training, then it gets a little bit trickier because okay, let's see how it's our performance doing. We're getting stronger. Okay, is getting stronger actually an objective of training for hypertrophy specifically, or is it a byproduct of our prior training?
Yeah, I mean, I think for, strength or hypertrophy, it's like it is an objective. Like you want it to occur because
Sure.
but it's more so you want it to occur. Well, with strength, you want it to occur because that is the goal. With hypertrophy, I mean, you're not necessarily trying to drive up your 1RM, but you want to see progression in, either rep strength, lifting more weight for the same amount of reps, same effort, or an increase in load with an existing rep range, because that's going to indicate that things are the level of volume that you're performing is more than likely quote unquote overloading in nature. You're providing a stimulus that is resulting in a positive adaptation.
Last time I talked to Eric Holmes, one key aspect of the training pyramid is that before progression, we have volume, intensity, and frequency, as those are the tools to actually get progression. So I think we can, after talking about that, establish a clear distinction between what is overload in training and what is progressive overload, because I think this is the key aspect when most of us get confused. Can we get definitions from overload and progressive overload?
Yeah. I think the overload the term overload can sort of be conceptualized as a threshold. I mean, we don't know specifically where it is on a given, day, but we need to provide sufficient stress in order to elicit a positive adaptation, that's going to move us forward. It's providing a stimulus that's going to result in, with hypertrophy, that's ultimately going to result in, protein synthesis exceeding protein breakdown, in between
Right.
sessions. So progressive overload, I think, distinguishing between the two is important, because progressive overload can then be sort of conceptualized as it's the observation of being able to do more because of those positive adaptations. It's the process of keeping pace with your ability to do more as you're able to do more. Because if we look at things from like the lens of hypertrophy, at the beginning we talked about, motor unit recruitment, and that amount of force that's going to be required to, recruit these higher threshold motor units is going to increase. And so, being able to lift more in order to keep those motor units, on a more, finer granular level, like to keep those motor units recruited in subsequent sessions, is going to require either doing more reps in order to, maintain
Right.
sufficient proximity to failure, or it's going to require, a heavier load in order to recruit those fibers, um, it, early enough in a set, essentially. So I think overload is doing enough to cause something positive to happen, and progressive overload is, because of those positive adaptations, we now have to, you know, be better because, we are better. We have to
Right.
be, lift more weight because we're capable now of lifting more weight. And that's what's required to continue to, recruit these higher threshold motor units.
But that capacity of actually lifting more weight is a result of the prior overload. Because the
Mm-hmm.
term on itself, progressive overload, it's a little bit misleading because we can easily think, okay, so progressively I need to add load. Uh, but what do you add? Volume, frequency, perhaps, all the possible variables. I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit misleading. So overload is what we do in our training through the manipulation of variables, let's say volume, intensity of effort. And then progressive overload is when we not reactively, well, reactively see increases in our performance. Am I getting it right, or am I still
Yeah. I mean, that's essentially, the distinguishing factor between the two is, one of them is actually an observation of a performance increase, whereas, you could create an overload stimulus, but do less weight than the session before. You could
Right.
just do more reps. And so it's one of those things where I think people get like the term load being in the like the word load being included in that term, I think tends to make people associate that with the requirement to lift more, on a session to session basis. And, there's a lot of people that do that. They'll try to, grind their way through additional reps that you know,
Right.
they haven't earned through adaptations yet, and at that point, it's just, have you really gotten better, or are you just simply trying harder? And that's why, something like volume, like you'll often hear, the there's more than one way to progressive overload, and that's certainly true. I mean, anything that shows an improvement in, performance capacity, is generally related to that. But like doing more volume, I would say, is more a tool to ensure that you're reaching that overload stimulus, that overload threshold, than it is an expression of improved performance. Because I mean, anybody can do an additional set even if they haven't improved. Your performance may suck, but it's like it's not really a volume in and of itself, in doing more isn't indicative that a positive adaptation has occurred. Whereas, you know, doing an additional rep or more load, all else equal, something has happened there, whether it be, on the neurological level, um, or, the muscular level that's accommodating that. And that's also, I mean, it could also be related to fitness and fatigue dynamics. Like you could have a reduction in fatigue, see no, adaptations, and see a net improvement. So that's why
Right.
it's important to view things over time rather than just on a, session to session basis. And if you're, breaking technique and, grossly breaking form in order to, check that box in your logbook, like you're missing the rationale behind it all.
Because there was this volume wars back in the day. It was all about doing more and more, and is because volume is the key driver for hypertrophy. Well, let's do more volume. And I know he's changed his views quite a bit and updated them. But in regards to the volume versus intensity model by Mike Israel,
Mm-hmm.
it was quite simple and quite clear that, okay, on a weekly basis, we can begin with the minimal effective volume, which tends to be 10 sets if you go to the meta-analytic evidence. And then as weeks go by, you go two sets perhaps, and then you end up at I think it was the model just in the paper about 6 weeks perhaps, I think. Don't remember
Yeah.
exactly. But
Yeah.
then you end up with 20 sets, which seem fairly logical because, okay, if we increase volume, maybe we can get a little bit more mechanical tension. But as you pointed out very clearly on the response, maybe that's not the case because maybe just by doing more volume, we become better at doing more volume, which is not equal to getting more hypertrophy. Can we talk a little bit about this idea of adding more volume and why it's a little bit more nuanced?
Yeah. So, the paper that Mike wrote, like I want to be clear that we don't know if, like, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a study that has matched volume across like a mesocycle, like one group having, 15 sets per week across, 4 weeks versus another group that, goes from 10 to 20 sets per week. There hasn't been a direct comparison to really assess the, I guess, that position. And it could be that it's possible that it is superior. We just don't know yet. But, the main reason, we wrote that response was because I think it can be a little bit misleading for people, in the sense that, like, the rationale behind the idea of adding volume over, adding load is, at least the one they presented was, volume has this observed dose response relationship with hypertrophy, which is true, but intensity does not, which is also true. Like you can grow similarly across a spectrum of rep ranges and intensities, you know. So, but I think that, like, on the surface, it makes sense then, like, okay, that would make sense that we would manipulate volume. But when we're talking about volume in these studies, it's comparing volume across, like, you know, one group performing, you know, 5 sets per week on average, and another group performing 10. It's not looking at within a mesocycle these, you know, escalations in volume. And I think that distinguishment is, you know, important, because the dose response is comparing volume across, like, the whole duration of the study to another amount of volume across that whole
Keeping it
duration.
static, right?
Yeah, generally. And I think there's been some research that has, you know, increased set volume. I believe Cody
I
Hahn.
think, yeah, that's the one. I think Cody Hunt did one, but up
Yeah,
to a certain point, there were no further increases after they corrected the water for the measurements.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, there's plenty of research to now to, you know, support the idea of, you know, there being that point of diminishing returns, or, you know, a regression in return. And I think, you know, logically that should make sense, right? Because
Right.
there's only so much you can recover from and positively adapt to, you know, like, once fatigue becomes an issue and starts limiting your ability to perform and your ability to overload, then that's going to negatively impact your, you know, hypertrophy, obviously. Um, so I think there's, you know, multiple reasons for that. But when people are, I guess, the idea of load progression being sort of a, um, you know, volume being superior to that, like, it's also not really accounting for the fact that, like, load progression to keep pace with these adaptations, like increasing load to maintain a specific rep range. And I think they even, if I recall, they even do mention that in their paper. Like, they're not advocating against increasing load. Like, they're not
Yeah,
doing
right.
that. They're more saying there seems to be a more robust relationship with volume than there is load, but we're applying it to a different landscape. You know, it's like
Yeah.
these are facts under a specific context, but we're trying to extrapolate it to, you know, what we're doing in the gym on a week to week basis. And that's not what those outcomes really came from. You know, that's not the design that they stemmed from. Um, so I think that that's the big thing. And the idea, you know, going from MEV up to MRV, you know, we don't know if that's disadvantageous or not. I mean, I think there's more evidence to support that it probably isn't. Um, you know, just the idea, like, we know there is a conceptual MEV. You know, there's this minimum effective volume, which can also be sort of conceptualized as synonymous with, like, the overload threshold. You know, this is the volume of stimulus that's required to, you know, cause this biochemical cascade, you know, after, you know, it's going to lead to net, you know, muscle protein. Um, you know, we know that there's the minimum, we know there's a maximum that we can recover from, we know there's a maximum that we can benefit from, but we don't know that that maximum that we can benefit from and the maximum we can recover from are necessarily the same thing. And, you know, the idea that you should work, you know, add load or add volume across a mesocycle, it's sort of built upon the assumption that that overload threshold is going to be increasing rapidly enough to substantiate the need to add volume in order to
On
maintain.
on a
And
week to
so
week basis.
on a week to week, or, you know,
Yeah.
semi-weekly. So it's, and, you know, I'm not against, I think, you know, we got a lot of comments after we put that response out, you know, and we're not, none of us are against the idea of adding volume, you know, and I think, like, easing into a block with, like, an introductory week, or, you know, 1 to 2 weeks where you're sort of bringing volume up to where, you know, historically, you know, you've benefited the most from, like, that sweet spot, you know, that's going to, like, I'm in full support of that. I just don't think, like if you were to stay at MEV and you just stayed there, but you just added load as you were able to do more, like that by definition is telling us that you're still above the overload threshold for some type of adaptation. You know, it's impossible to know specifically what's driving that. But you know, that if you're progressing from 1 week to the next without increasing volume, that's, you know, evidence that it's certainly not required to increase volume in order to accommodate that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the rationale of Dr. Mike's there is, you know, that overload or the minimum effective volume will increase as, you know, the block goes on, and then by the end, what will be your like maximum adaptive volume or your sweet spot for volume will actually be close to MRV. And there's just not any evidence, you know, that we came across or that I'm aware of that indicates that that's the case. And MRV, like you said, I think it's more related to workload capacity than, you know, what you're actually going to benefit from. And, you know, there's people that have a really high work capacity. In fact, you know, there was a review, I'd have to find it. It's referenced in our response, but they were trying to, basically the design was an intent to overreach a number of subjects. And by the time, like the definition of MRV that they use is, you know, you're unable to maintain performance, you know, or this is, you know, the most volume you can do and retain performance before seeing a regression. I mean, that's essentially the same as like overreaching. You know, the idea of overreaching is, you know, you start to see a decrement in performance. And so in that review, a lot of the studies, I think it was almost half of the studies where they tried to intentionally overreach these people. The people that they did eventually overreach and saw this decline in performance, they were performing volumes that, based off of, you know, meta-analytic data that we have, was, you know, substantially in excess of kind of that recommended range. So I think they're disassociated to a large degree. I think they can be related. Like if somebody's work capacity is so poor that they're not able to sort of get to that, you know, the top of that conceptual inverted U, like they're just not able to recover from the training that their, I guess, skeletal muscle would benefit from, if that makes sense. Like somebody who's super, like I hate to pick on powerlifters, but like, you know, some powerlifters, I think in general, well, not in general, but a lot of them have, you know, their work capacity isn't going to be as high as somebody who's training with high amounts of volume. And a lot of that is just a byproduct of their training. But, you know, they may find that higher volumes out of the gate, you know, they accrue a lot of muscle damage, you know, a lot of fatigue, and they need to adapt to that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that stimulus isn't beneficial. They're just not able to, I guess, benefit from it as much because of the impacts of things like muscle damage, the impacts of performance due to, you know, a lower work capacity. And so making sure that I think it's theoretically possible for someone's MRV to actually be below what is optimal for them. But I don't think that's the norm. You know, I think that's, you know, specific circumstances. And in that case, yeah, you would want to improve your ability to handle volume so you can handle what, you know, the anabolic machinery within your body is capable of managing. So does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, but it kind of leaves us maybe in the dark as to, okay, so progressive load is not what I thought it was. What am I going to do in the gym? Do I have to chase the pump? Do I have to chase more load? Do I have to chase more sets? Well, maybe more sets after all this conversation. Maybe not, because we can talk about work capacity, but not as strictly as more volume, more hypertrophy, maybe up to a certain point, but it's a moving target. So what can we actually do, and how can we assess progression, and we can assess it, I think, by doing it reactively and proactively. What is the difference between the two, and what sort of strategies can we use?
Like I tend to favor approaches that don't have an excessive amount of moving parts. Like there's a lot, like if you're, adjusting proximity to failure, if you're adjusting load, you're adjusting set volume, like it's hard to really assess the relative impact of each of those. And so if you see success, it's easy to be, to have this bias towards that strategy. It's like, okay, well, this worked for me, and it did, but we
Sure,
don't
sure.
know, what was necessarily the main driver of that. So um I like to keep it a little simpler. Like I do tend to ramp up volume, at least with that individual of where this sweet spot is for volume for them. And that can be guided by the research, to some extent, like a starting point, their training experience and things like that. But then from there, I'm also a a fan. I mean, this is by no means required to do it this way, but keeping proximity to failure somewhat standardized across a mesocycle for a given exercise. One of the reasons for that is aren't most people aren't great at estimating their proximity to failure. The difference between like a 3 RIR and a 2 RIR is going to be like it's a crapshoot. Um, so keeping it close enough to failure where it's, that margin of error goes down, but far enough from failure where you're avoiding like these highly, fatiguing reps where there's, this exponential increase in fatigue, training to failure versus leaving, a couple reps in the tank, I think is helpful. So something in that 2 to 3 RIR range, for isolation movements, maybe, 1 to 2. And then just kind of keeping it there and getting the athlete comfortable with that, what that feels like, and they're confident in their ability to gauge that. And then from there, if we're, you know, progressing in terms of reps with an existing load at that same RIR, or progressing in terms of weight with or for an existing amount of reps at that RIR, like that tells us that something has happened, or there's been, a change in fatigue dynamics. But generally, like across a training block, someone's going to be accruing more fatigue rather than dissipating fatigue. I mean, not always, but in most cases. So, their preparedness isn't going to be as much of a factor, I think, is the adaptations when you see like these trends over time. Um, but like that would be like a example of reactive progression. You're keeping these fixed variables in place, like set volume, um, proximity to failure, and then you're basically, rather than chasing a specific number of reps or chasing a load, you're chasing that level of relative effort. It's like, okay, I'm going to pick this weight, I'm going to take it till I reach a 2 RIR, then I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to assess, like, okay, like I'm not going to grind an additional rep out because I only matched my previous weeks.
Right, right.
It's going, like, you have to be honest with, more of these reactive strategies, because, the reason we're using them to begin with is because they provide insight into, the effectiveness of the strategy and the level of volume that we are performing. So proactive progression, as the name implies, would be more like, okay, I'm going to add load every single week, or add reps every week. And there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. In fact, like for beginners, they're going to be adapting at such a quick rate that that's probably going to be beneficial for them, because they also have a tendency to not really like to, they're not really comfortable pushing themselves as someone who's been training a little bit longer. And so it sort of forces them to, you know it's essentially a built-in way that they can keep pace with these adaptations without having to rely on subjective means like proximity to failure and things like that. So and you can have a combination between the two, like, and this is something I use with a lot of people that are kind of interested in strength and hypertrophy. Is we
Sure.
will lean on load progression on a somewhat regular basis, whether that be an increase in 1 RM or a top set that's increasing in RPE. But we still I may have somebody, okay, let's add 5 pounds this week, but I still only want you going to this relative effort or this proximity to failure. And so, generally what you see with that approach is you'll see reps, as load goes up, reps are going to come down, and that's expected, but as long as they're still performing, you know, with an adequate number of reps, something like 5 or 6 reps or more, then we can kind of look at it and compare, like set volume. When we talked earlier about hypertrophy not being load specific, like that, like using set volume is a tool in, I guess, proxy for a hypertrophy stimulus. It's a reliable method, but you want to make sure reps are sufficient. So like, and that speaks to the, I guess, duration of exposure element to volume.
Right.
Like doing a top single is going to, recruit every motor unit that you have available to you, but it's not going to provide the hypertrophy stimulus that, a set of 10 would, and so, so there is a requisite amount of volume within a set in terms of reps that, you should be trying to get if you're going to be comparing, using set volume for planning your hypertrophy. So, with that being said, like you tend to see when you increase load and you see these reps come down, if you're still, getting 6+ reps on your sets, like you're in reaching that same relative effort, like that's still it's proactive, but it's auto-regulated in nature because you're still
Right,
using
right.
these sort of caps in terms of proximity to failure.
So I think for the most part we can be more reactive, right?
Yeah,
Not
I
not
think,
just adding and adding and adding more of anything.
I mean, I think if you're adding and adding, sorry, I'm on the phone real quick. If you're,
Words.
sorry, if you're adding and adding, and you're able to maintain your technique, and you're like, you're not, just trying harder for the sake of doing more than the
Sure.
last week, then I mean that there's really nothing wrong with that. It's like if you're able to add load and still see that a positive adaptation has occurred, like there's the mission accomplished, like there's nothing wrong with that. But the more advanced somebody becomes, the slower their rates of adaptation are going to be. And so having a more assertive progression in terms of, doing more reps, more weight every single session, I mean, that's going to result in a lot more fatigue than is probably, recommended. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is, not only is because our rate of adaptation is slower as we advance in training age, like the more important it becomes to, manage fatigue as well, because it's like that difference, being able to assess preparedness is going to be, um, even harder to be objective with it, because you can have this stimulus that's resulting in a positive adaptation, but it's accruing a ton of fatigue, and now you're not able to, you know, provide the stimulus the next session that you would benefit most from. So, um, so yeah, I think it's easy to say like we should be more reactive in nature, and I think on paper we should be, especially as we advance in training age. It's hard. I think it's like hardwired into a lot of us, when we learn about training
Yeah, yeah.
and progression. And I catch myself doing it too. It's, in the back of my mind, I know I hit, 11 reps on this exercise. And if I get to 9 and I'm realizing like, okay,
This
today I
sucks,
just don't,
man.
yeah, today I just don't have it. Like I'd be lying if I said like occasionally I don't find myself cheating and, trying to grind out a couple too, but, a couple more reps. But it's like, I think just being aware of that makes a big difference. And like being able to recognize and being self-aware in knowing when you're kind of getting greedy a little bit is important. And that's going to go a long way in managing that fatigue. So, and the other thing too, I think a lot of people look at, these reactive models is sort of a way to constrain the amount of effort that they're putting in. It's like, okay, well, I don't want to shortchange myself, but the truth is like it's going to let like auto regulation in general, using RPE. It's not just a method of controlling fatigue. It's a method of capitalizing on when your preparedness is actually higher as well. So like if you're
Right, right.
well recovered, like you should push it. Like you should push it in order to ensure that you're getting the amount of stimulus in that you require for positive adaptation. So it works both ways. I think we tend to view it as a tool to protect us against ourselves, but it's it's also there's been days where I am training and maybe I don't feel great, but my performance is actually better than I had expected, and I find myself having to push a little bit further within a set than maybe I was mentally prepared to do, and that's going to happen sometimes too.
Because I think that's also a misconception that don't progress sets just like that. Watch your RPEs, your fatigue. People often think that this is because we're sissies. We don't like to train hard, but it's actually to get more exposure to the stimulus of training to manage fatigue and keep actually pushing, right?
Yeah, and I exactly. I mean, people, there's a difference between like just redlining it within a session and like yeah, the harder you push, the higher the you're kind of turning that knob in terms of stimulus. But you have to balance that with your ability to recover from it, and come back and provide another overload stimulus, or stimulus that's overloading in nature. So, and that, again, that doesn't mean it has to be more reps than the session prior. You can
Right.
still have an overload stimulus, but performance be, less and not as much, because we know that there's that range, like that range for effective volume, that concept can be applied to the stimulus as well. And so unless you're always training at and you're at the MEV for your, per session stimulus, chances are you're probably somewhere in the middle in most cases. And a day where your performance is down, you are likely still taking steps forward as long as you're pushing to a, reasonable proximity to failure on those sets.
Right.
And then the other thing, and I think this is sort of a message that gets lost in people that are sort of critiquing a reactive model. A lot of like bro bodybuilders and anybody who started off that was training to failure every set, and never really logging anything. They would just go in and blast a muscle group and come back and blast another muscle group. In a sense, like, yes, it's probably not optimal because of the fatigue impact, but if you're going to failure on every set, in a sense, that is a reactive progression, especially if you're doing the same exercise. And so, you may find if you're going to failure, but those people are doing more reps in order to achieve that failure, like they're keeping pace with their adaptation. They're just not keeping their
That's
fatigue,
it.
their fatigue in check, So like, you hear, and I'm a big proponent of like logging training to be able to, look at, historical data, but it's not like that's required in order to grow, like you could, as long as you're proficient enough in the lift, in the movement pattern where you're not like, beginners tend to like, the neurological component is the limiting factor for them, like the coordination component and being able to really, get high degrees of activity in these higher threshold motor units, like that improves as you become more skilled in the movement. But someone who's been training a while, it's like you or I could hop on probably any leg machine, any type of leg press that we've never tried before, and it's close enough to the raw movement pattern that it's not like we have to learn the movement, in order to provide an overload stimulus.
Right.
At least, for the most part. There's probably some exceptions, like barbell free weight movements. Like if I were to start doing front squats, which I haven't done in forever, but if I were to start doing front squats, it would probably take me, a week or two to really gain back the proficiency in the movement for it to really provide any value, in terms of hypertrophy anyway.
Sure.
And that's like, I'm not a huge fan of that for hypertrophy anyway. But the point is, with these advanced athletes that are training to failure every session, like they're not really limited by their proficiency in the movement patterns. And if they're training to failure and they're performing sufficient set volume, which they usually are, they're probably, many of them are probably on the right side of that inverted U curve, but they're still seeing
Right,
a
right.
net benefit. You're going to grow because you are standardizing your effort and you're, oftentimes performing more reps in order to get there. I think it's the people that go in and say, okay, I want to do 3 sets of 10 on this exercise, and they don't really account for the proximity to failure where, over time that can compound and result in, less gains. But yeah, I think there's something to be said for the people that go in and just kind of fly by the seat of their pants and blast a muscle group.
Yeah.
It's likely not optimal, but someone that's doing that is probably better off than somebody who is, in terms of muscle growth anyway, assuming they don't get hurt, is better than somebody who's going in and, they're too conservative and, they're logging every little thing and crunching
Right.
numbers
True.
and, they're really obsessing over, okay, was that a 2 or a 3 RIR, and things like that. Like that stuff it's important, but it's not like you're going to be achieving the objective probably in either case there.
Because hypertrophy in itself is quite forgiving of an adaptation.
It
So,
is.
Brian, just to for the last couple of minutes to make it a little bit more practical, can we talk
Mm-hmm.
briefly? I know I want to be respectful of your time about the single, double, and triple progression models. Just briefly, I don't want to take much of your time.
Yeah. Single progression is just manipulating one variable. I mean, usually it's load or reps. Picking, okay, I did 225 for a set of 10 on bench. Next week, I'll do 230 for a set of 10. And I think, single progression can be, can have value, especially for compound lifts. I do like to keep like RAR kind of capped. And like the example I provided earlier where, I'll have somebody increase weight each week, but their RIR will stay, the assigned RIR will stay constant. That's still a single progression. Double progression is the idea of progressing reps before load typically. And oftentimes like traditional double progression is just the, say you're training in the 8 to 12 rep range, use 100 pounds and you do, 3 sets of 8 the first week. And then the next week you do, 100 pounds for 3 sets of 9, and then 100 pounds for 3 sets of 10. And then once you get to 3 sets of 12, you add load the next week and you start back down at 8. And there's, I think, a lot of, I mean, it makes sense because like you have to think of the amount of adaptation that needs to occur in order to, be capable of doing an additional rep is generally going to be a less, lower magnitude of adaptation that's going to take to do more load for the same amount of reps in many
Right.
cases. So I think that's a useful tool for like isolation movements where, changes in absolute load are pretty substantial. But I like the idea of making that auto-regulated, like the dynamic double progression is what we call it, or called it. It's essentially just using that same concept, but having an RPE or RIR cap for each set. So, and then once you reach the top end of your rep range for a given set, then the next week you can increase load for that set. And I have an article I wrote for like JPS Fitness. If you just Google, I think dynamic double progression, JPS, it'll pop up, and it walks through like some of the caveats to that. But that's I think kind of the best of both worlds for some of these movements, because you're progressing load as you're able to progress load, but you're still biasing rep improvements typically before that. And then triple progression is, it's changing load and reps and sets like in a sequence. Sometimes they're done in different sequences. I personally don't use it that much because it's just a lot of moving parts, to be honest. It can be kind of confusing for people, and I don't really know what additional benefit it would provide. It does modulate the volume up and down a little bit, but and I think there's something to be said for, you don't want to keep volume static all the time. And that's the other thing. It's like, even though we're keeping volumes relatively static in a block, doesn't mean that we're not cycling volume if you back up, and you look at it, because you still have these deload periods where you're reducing volume by, 30 to 70%, and then you're, ramping back up with an intro week. And so the volume still undulates, but, there's more like flat spots kind of at the top in that model. But triple progression, yeah, it's essentially, I think typically people will progress reps and then add additional sets. And then once they get to, whatever the amount of sets they want, then they'll add load at that point. So yeah, that's basically the premise. And I mean, you can auto-regulate single and double progression very easily, and be reactive with it. So that's my, I guess, weapon of choice when it comes to those two, is using these reactive strategies within that. And I think over time, people, they're not necessarily chasing numbers, but when they take a step back, they realize, wow, I'm doing 20 more pounds for a set of 10 at the same difficulty as I was 6 months ago. And so that's when hypertrophy, assuming they've been eating like in a adequate surplus, is going to likely be a contributing factor there. You don't want to discount the impacts of neurological adaptations. But and I think the last thing I wanted to mention was, comparing performance at similar time points. Like when we say, if you're progressing over time, like if you're looking at your week 5 numbers of a block and you're comparing them to your numbers, in week 1 of another block, that can be a little bit misleading at times. Like you want to sort of standardize the amount of fatigue that you probably are carrying at that point, if you want to make like the most accurate comparison, So, okay, in this point in the block, when I'm, generally carrying some residual fatigue, I'm performing better than I was at that point, 3 blocks ago. So that's sort of the method that I use to kind of assess volume, essentially. And if somebody is progressing well and they're an advanced athlete, like any progress is good progress if you're, training at a high level. And so, keeping somebody healthy too. And I think, that can be the bottleneck for a lot of people with volume. You may be able to benefit from more, like in terms of muscle growth, but what is the impact on longevity in doing that? It may be fine, but other people, like I know I can probably benefit from a lot more squat volume than I do, but physically it would, I'm constrained more by just connective tissue and joint discomfort, after a while. And so you kind of have to, in practice, operate outside this vacuum with volume and realize there's a lot that's going to influence the appropriate amount of volume, within a training career when you're accounting for everything, rather than just what's going to cause my muscle fibers to grow the most, And so, what's going to keep you progressing in the gym the most is probably going to be what's going to result in the most muscle growth over time.
Very well. But health, I mean, are we all in it for the gains and solely for the gains? I mean, health.
Solely. health health is always secondary.
It can wait. It can get on the back. So, Brian, I don't want to take any more of your time. It's been a really comprehensive chat. I cannot thank you enough for your time and for your
Yeah, I
knowledge. It's been a
appreciate it.
huge pleasure. So, anytime you want to come to Mexico, you're more than welcome.
I'm down. Yeah, definitely take you up on that.
Very well. So, thank you very much. I hope you have
All
a
right.
really good day and see you again.
You too. Thanks a lot. And thanks for everybody who watched. All right,
Thank
take
you,
care.
Brian.
Bye.